graphic location in the chat box, which you'll find in the toolbar at the bottom of the screen. And we would just like to know where you're tuning in from. Second, you are muted, and we ask that you stay that way until we have breakout sessions. It just makes it easier for everyone to hear, and we don't have dogs barking in the background and so forth. And third, please also put questions into the chat box. Christina Crost will be monitoring those. Christina is the policy coordinator for Faith in Place, the Illinois affiliate of Interfaith Power and Light, and she's also the United Methodist Women's Climate Justice Guide for the North Central jurisdiction. So she's also handling all of our Zoom responsibilities tonight. So thank you, Christina, for doing all of that. And finally, as you probably just got a notice, I know I did, this webinar is being recorded and will be shared with you along with other follow-up items by email in a day or so. So I think those were all the housekeeping items we needed to share. So again, welcome, and let's take a moment to ground our work this evening in prayer. So if you would, let us pray. Loving God, thank you for all the ways you surround us with your love every moment of every day. We thank you this evening, especially for the wonder and bounty of this living earth. Help us to be faithful protectors of this miraculous gift, and give us the courage to work for just access to your creation for all your children, all of humanity, and all our fellow creatures. This we pray in Christ's name. Amen. So again, welcome everybody. And just a quick word about who is putting this evening's webinar on. Christina, if you could please show that first slide about that. We are the Federal Climate Legislation Working Group of the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement, which was formed in 2019. And to find out more about the mission of the Creation Justice Movement, please check the website, which is uncreationjustice.org. Sounds like we got somebody who's not muted. Make sure everybody's muted. Thank you. And you can see a link to that site in the chat box as well to learn more about our movement. The Federal Climate Legislation Working Group was given 3 basic tasks. First, to study and evaluate federal legislation that addresses the climate crisis. Second, to recommend what bills to support to the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement Coordinating Committee. And third, to help activate United Methodists across the church to advocate for that legislation. Next slide, please, Christina. So starting in the fall of 2019, we began establishing guidelines for our work based on the social principles of the United Methodist Church. We then put together a scorecard for evaluating specific pieces of legislation based on those guidelines. 2 major aspects of the scoring were, first, does legislation contribute to deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions with the goal of achieving net zero emissions no later than 2050? And second, does the legislation address the harm of climate change to vulnerable communities in the US and throughout the world? And does it assist communities dependent on the fossil fuel industry successfully transition to a clean energy economy? So those were the 2 main things: deep reductions in greenhouse gas emissions and environmental justice for evaluating legislation. We of course recognize that no single bill is likely to include both of those criteria sufficiently. That it's likely that there need to be some combination of bills to address both of them adequately. Next slide, please, Christina. So with those guidelines in mind, then last summer, we put together a report recommending 3 bills for consideration by the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement Coordinating Committee. They were 2 carbon, either carbon tax or carbon fee bills, they're called both sometimes, that are aimed at deep reduction of greenhouse gases. House Bill HR 763, the Energy Innovation and Carbon Dividend Act, and House Bill HR 4051 and its companion Senate Bill S2284, which is the Climate Action Rebate Act, and they're both carbon tax or carbon fee bills. Both bills levy taxes on the production of fossil fuels. They would levy if they're passed. That would be raised over a several-year period. And the purpose of the rising taxes is to use a marketplace to move producers and consumers away from carbon-emitting products to clean energy ones. I'm seeing somebody that says we don't see the slides. I'm seeing them, so I'm not sure what the deal is with that, but Christina maybe can look into that. And also we recommended one environmental justice. Somebody else says they do see them. So we did recommend also one environmental justice bill, HR 2156, the Reclaim Act, which would provide funding for fossil fuel industry dependent communities to make the transition to a clean energy economy. And you can see our committee's full report in the link in the chat box, and we will also send that in a follow-up email. So anyway, what happened then was that the coordinating committee was real busy with preparing for a fall conference, and so just didn't get around to making a decision about whether to go along with that recommendation. But then as we got closer to the election, it became increasingly clear that depending upon the outcome of the election, of the 2020 elections, that the scope of climate-related bills might expand in significant ways, and we now see that that is exactly what has happened. So moving forward, in addition to seeing where things stand with the bills we recommended last year, we will also be looking at legislation being put forward by the Biden administration and by members of Congress now or and here in this year, and making recommendations for advocacy based on which bills, again, fit the guiding principles based on the social principles of the church. And in fact, one of the main functions of this webinar is to get a better feel for what may be forthcoming in the way of federal legislation. And Christine, if we could see the next slide, please. So before looking at what is going on with federal climate policy this year, just a few quick reminders of how this work is deeply connected to our Christian faith, because that's obviously what motivates us. And first, God called creation good and gave humanity the work of faithful stewardship of it, to be caretakers of the earth. Second, as the work of God's hands, all of creation is worthy of protection. All living things have intrinsic worth quite apart from their usefulness to us, to humanity. And furthermore, our ability, humanity's ability to thrive, is maybe even to survive, is totally dependent on the health of the whole of creation. And finally, and importantly, Christ, through his words and example, called his followers to care especially for the most hurting in society. In this evening's context, that means that we are to pay special attention to addressing the harm of climate change to vulnerable communities here in the US and throughout the world, and especially communities of color. And it also means that as we look at solutions to the climate crisis, we make sure that those solutions don't unintentionally negatively impact those vulnerable neighbors. But we also recognize that regions of the country that provide the energy that we all currently depend on are facing economic disruption as the country begins to move away from fossil fuels. So therefore, there is also a moral imperative to help these neighbors too, as the global transition to clean energy takes place. Next slide, please. And so and there's going to be 3 slides in a row here, which Christine, you can just run through. But for more on the faith foundations of our work, we just recommend that you look at the section on the natural world and the 2016 social principles of the church, as well as resolutions pertaining to this work. And again, you will find a link to them in the chat, and we'll also send that in a follow-up email. So just one final point, dealing with the climate crisis is a matter of great urgency. I'm guessing you share that feeling, or you probably wouldn't be on this call. But scientists are increasingly clear in their warnings that greenhouse gas emissions must be reduced dramatically over the next several years if we are to keep global warming below 2 degrees Celsius, and ideally below 1.5 degrees Celsius, because there's a big difference between 1.5 and 2 in terms of what's done. But we got to keep it below 2 for sure to avoid terrible devastation to all the ecosystems that sustain life on Earth. So there's a real immediacy to our work. And it is our sincere hope that this webinar will contribute to galvanizing caring United Methodists, such as yourselves, to take action to advocate strongly and in a coordinated way for federal public policy that acts quickly to avert this immense threat to God's good creation. Okay, I wanted to kind of set that context. So here's what we're going to be doing for the next approximate hour and 15 minutes. First of all, we're going to go right into breakout groups to get you engaged and to give you an opportunity to meet each other. And Jan Berry, who is with our federal climate legislation working group, will lead that piece, and I'll introduce Jan in a minute. Then we're going to have 3 presentations on the lay of the land of federal climate policy actions geared towards greenhouse gas reductions and climate justice. The first will be from Wes Govar with the organization Evergreen, who will present the key policy proposals of that group and how they were built around relationships with environmental justice groups and frontline communities. And then second, we will have Andrew Hartley from this federal climate legislation working group, who will summarize the executive actions on climate already taken by the Biden administration and perhaps ones that may still be taken. And third will be from John Hill from the Board of Church and Society, who will outline various approaches to congressional action on climate that may be forthcoming from the new Congress. And then after that, we'll give you a chance to share your thoughts about all that in the same breakout group that you're in to begin with. At least we're hoping that's the way it works out with the tech stuff. And then we'll end with an invitation to action and ways to stay engaged. So anyway, really glad you're here. Now, just a quick word about Jan Berry. If you could see that slide, Jan, I think it's up. Before she leads us in the next piece of this webinar, Jan worked for 35 years as an engineering project manager at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, a U.S. Department of Energy, Environment, and Energy Research facility. Her work there included cleaning up Cold War waste throughout the U.S., as well as the management of domestic and international advanced energy systems. In recent years, Jan has become a strong climate advocate. In addition to her work with this team, she is the Tennessee State Coordinator for a Citizens Climate Lobby and serves as the chair of the Holston Conference Creation Care Committee. She is also a proud wife of 53 years, mother of 2 daughters, and grandmother of 6 adult grandchildren. So Jan, really glad you're part of this team, and thanks for all you have done in the past and that you're currently doing. And I'll just let you take it away for sharing about what we're gonna do next.
Well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate it. You know, we do have a new Congress, a new president, and new opportunity for climate advocacy. So that's really quite an opportunity. We wanted to give you a chance to see what the overview of executive actions and federal legislation is. You know, it's an interesting and complex topic. So we put together a handout that really just lays out all the things that we could find that have been done and an overview from executive actions and executive orders. And then also just a little summary of how legislation is developing. So I'm clicking right now, entering a.
See, Jan, yeah, I think you muted yourself just for a second there.
Okay, all I did was hit enter. Okay. Okay, well, I'm trying to enter something in the chat and it's not letting me. It keeps muting me when I do that, so I'll do that later. So I'm going to put a link to the overview of the executive actions and federal legislation in the chat. And I think this handout will be a really good guide for you to have and hopefully help you not only tonight to follow what we're talking about, but also in the future as you look for opportunities to advocate. We're going to go into breakout sessions now. We just want to get to know each other. It's going to be about 5 minutes. You'll introduce yourselves and talk where you came from, and then talk about why you joined this webinar. And you'll have about 1 minute each to do that. But we really would like you to, as a group, figure out what excites you about this webinar and what do you think it would take to help you become an advocate for action on climate change at the federal level. So Christina, I think you're all set up to put people in their groups, and you will see these same people at the end. So you'll be able to chat now and get to know each other, and then you'll come back later and get to chat with each other about what you think about the webinar. Thanks.
Hey there, if you're having any trouble getting into your breakout room, you should have been sent a, you should have something on your screen that says to go to a breakout room. So you would just click on it and it would take you to your breakout room.
See, can you hear me, Christina?
There we go. I'm trying to find Jan to get her unmuted.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm unmuted. Here I was talking away.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead and put what excites you about being here in the chat. Go ahead and type it in, what your group talked about, and Christina and I will look at the chat and we'll read some of those back to the group in the time we have remaining. So I'll cheat a little bit. We wanted to get back to work. We wanted to get back on track after the last 4 years where we've kind of gone in reverse on climate action. That's what our group wanted to do. So we're excited about new possibilities with the new administration. Want to learn more about work at the national level. We want to control our climate. We want to be able to, not have runaway climate change. You see anything there, Christina? You have to unmute yourself too.
Right. Let's see. I'm seeing in the chat that there was not enough time to go very deep, which, is kind of the problem when we gather together like this virtually on a time schedule. But good news is that we're hoping to kind of mobilize a grassroots network of advocates around the country. And so you may have an opportunity to get to know each other a little bit better in further work that we'll be doing hopefully together. What else do I see?
Red regions versus blue regions. Yes, I'm Tennessee, we're right in the middle of that, yes.
Central Illinois, right there with you. So solidarity, if you feel like you're the only one in your community who cares about these things, please know you're not alone, but also know that there's strength in numbers and we can help each other out.
All right. Well, thank you, Jan, and Christina, and Jan for getting that introduced, and thanks all of you for participating and getting engaged. And I know I enjoyed getting to know Steve and Donna from Kentucky and Steve from Minnesota a little bit, and so that was really nice. So we're gonna move right along because we're on a pretty tight time schedule. And next we will hear from Wes Gobar, and if you could maybe pull up that slide, Christina, who, as I noted earlier, will present the key federal policy proposals of the Evergreen organization and how they are built around relationships with environmental justice groups and frontline communities. Evergreen describes its mission as, quote, leading the fight to put bold climate action at the top of America's agenda, implementing an all-out mobilization to defeat climate change and create millions of jobs in a clean energy economy. And Wes is a co-founder and deputy press secretary for Evergreen. He's also the co-founder of the Black Oak Collective, a DC-based network organization for Black environmental professionals. Wes previously served as a confidential assistant and executive aide to Virginia Attorney General Mark Herring. He is a native of Fredericksburg, Virginia, and a graduate of the University of Virginia, where he studied history and government. His interest in advocacy began in Charlottesville as a racial justice student organizer at UVA. And Wes's writing has been published in Vox. I don't know if you say Vox or Vox, but VOX, the New York Times, and the Washington Post. And Wes will have 10 minutes to present. It's a tight time frame, but we just don't have a whole lot of time. And then we'll have about 5 minutes for questions. So please put your questions for Wes in the chat box, and Christina will be monitoring those. So Wes, we're just really glad to have you with us, and just ask you to go ahead and take it away.
Thank you so much, Paul. So we're really just at a critical moment. I have this picture of Houston here, and spotlighting the justice with the disparity in the city. And the thing is, we continue to see more and more unpredictable weather, and we also now have a unprecedented chance with this new president and Congress. And if you can go to the next slide, please. So prior to 2017, the Democrats really didn't have a unified climate policy. Net zero by 2050 was really considered a pipe dream, and we were really focused on trying to redo carbon pricing cap and trade that had been done in 2009. And the IPCC came out with a report saying we had until 2030 to make a difference and to avoid the worst of global warming. And the Green New Deal also came on the scene and mirroring racial justice, economic justice, address transition, and bold climate action. And it's still a resolution and organizing framework, but if you look closely at all climate action, from Biden and Congress and the proposals, they really follow this basic framework: clean energy standards, bold public investments, and environmental justice. And that's a really critical frame to understand what Evergreen is advocating for. And so there's a number of sectors that the amount of emissions that come from the U.S. economy are huge and come from a number of sectors. And I've listed a couple here where we have specific standards and policies, but agriculture and manufacturing are also there. But transportation, we need not only clean vehicles, but more public transportation. We need to create green energy efficient buildings. And the most important one is a clean electricity standard, because we need a clean electricity grid. We saw grid problems all across the South in Houston. And if we turn the grid to being 100% clean energy by 2035, we can lower utility bills for people, put people to work building that new grid, and also get to 70–80% of reductions. The next slide, please. 1 out of 3 Americans live in a city or state that has put together a pledge for clean electricity by a certain date. And so this is a policy, whether it's a just renewable portfolio standard, clean energy standards, this is a policy that's proven, and it's done really in lots of places across the country. And so I'll give a brief explanation on what that is, and then just to sort of bare bones, and if people have questions, they can ask later. But basically, the government says utilities, you have by 2035 to get 100% clean energy. And 2035 is the number that Biden ran on. And each year there is a benchmark, a percentage that, a percentage of your utilities energy generation has to be a clean energy source, whether that's wind or solar or, a few other exceptions, and or geothermal or hydro. And that there's a mix, a lot of ways that you can achieve that and make it happen, and a mix of penalties and benefits. But you can also do it through reconciliation. And that means we can do it with 51 votes. We have 51 votes in the Senate. We have the House. We can do it. We can get it done. And next slide, please. Just as another note, we also spend a lot of money supporting fossil fuels. Biden promised to end fossil fuels, and there's a very broad direct and indirect ways we do that, and we need to get that done. Just as a side note. Next slide. And so Biden also ran on $2 trillion in public investments, and there's a lot that we can do and that we need to do with that money that will also, invest in justice, invest in disadvantaged communities, and also, again, get the economy running again after COVID-19. And so I've listed a few examples in there of things that we need to do, and especially, some of them will again just make we'll invest in the stuff we need to. Get clean energy to make housing and energy and bills like more affordable for folks, as well as just put people to work, making a better world, restoring the environment. And so I'll just move to the next slide. Next slide. It's not important. Environmental justice. We've known about these impacts for a very long time. This chart comes from a report from the 1980s called Race, Waste, and Toxic Space. The race, space, and toxic waste. The number one predictor of your proximity to a toxic waste facility, to oil facility, anything like that, that is not income, it's actually race, if you're Black or Latino community. And there's a lot of historical reasons for that, like segregation and redlining, but that's really important for framing what the policy needs to look like. Next slide, please. And as an example, Lake Charles in Louisiana, that's a industrial plant that was hit by 2 hurricanes this year and spewed all kinds of toxic fumes in the middle of a pandemic. And now they're facing a blackout. So many of these communities that are at the front lines of the climate crisis also need this deep investment and a transition away from fossil fuels. Next slide. And so we need to collect this data. We need a federal map to do that. We need to say, to get the health impacts, to get the demographic data, and to say, who is most affected by this problem. And Biden pledged to not only do that, but use that map to guide federal decisions to say, I'm investing $2 trillion in 4 years in climate. 40% of that is going to go to disadvantaged communities. And we're going to invest in, make sure they're not only cleaning up these communities, but putting them at the heart of this new clean energy economy. There are several states which already do this as well. I'll go to the next slide. And just three easy numbers that you can remember this in. 106 clean electricity by 2035, $2 trillion in federal investments, and then 40% towards disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. I'm not going to walk through all the climate actions to date, but he signed orders to establish a climate corps, to build steps towards dedicating that 40% towards disadvantaged communities, towards getting a domestic climate office, procurement. So now the federal government, their cars, they have a huge fleet of hundreds of thousands of cars, and construction, those are going to move towards being clean energy. Next slide. The Democratic Party has really adopted this framework. And so there's a great chance of passing a lot of these things that I've described. It was a huge issue in the primary, and Biden, this was not originally his plan. After winning the primary, he took the unprecedented step of talking to environmental justice leaders, to environmental groups such as Evergreen Action, and as well as the Bernie Biden task force, and coming up with this bigger plan. And there was also some other data points on plans that have backed a lot of these measures. Next slide, please. And so if you're looking at groups that have endorsed similar platforms and you want to follow their lead and look at what they're supporting and work and organizing with them, advocating with them, I've listed a few here. The Thrive Agenda is a product of the Green New Deal Network, which is an organizing arm to get a Green New Deal, and they're pushing a lot of the most aggressive version of this stuff and trying to push even further. And the U.S. Climate Action Network is a alignment of dozens of climate groups across the country. The Blue Green Alliance is a coalition between labor groups and environmentalists. And the Equitable and Just National Climate Platform is focused on environmental justice lens specifically. Next slide. These policies are really, really popular. They're not, fringe or radical, and there's been a lot of polling on clean electricity standard. Next slide. Thrive Agenda is very popular. Next slide. And the 40% pledge is very popular as well. The next slide. It just, before the election, they found that this $2 trillion climate plan was more popular than national mask mandate or the Affordable Care Act. And also just the clean electricity standard also even had a majority, 49% support from Republicans. Next slide. So we've been here before. We've had a Democratic, 10 years ago, we had a Democratic president, Congress, everything like that. And we tried to push through, at the time, we tried to push through Waxman-Markey, which was a cap and trade program. And the wide consensus among both lawmakers and the environmental movement as to why that didn't necessarily work is that it did not have support from Black and brown communities, environmental justice advocates, from sufficient support from labor or grassroots groups. So when it passed the House, but when it came time to whip those final votes in the Senate, the movement was not behind it. And that is the genesis of some of this standards investment justice framework. So I'll move on to the next slide and talk a little bit more about the limits of carbon pricing and why it should be a complement to a policy, but not the sole policy. Next slide, please. And so, unfortunately, we really have to get where we need to get by 2030. And we've seen in other countries, but also just California, emissions have actually risen after cap and trade was instituted, but it's funded a lot of great stuff. And so, next slide, please. Carbon pricing increases the cost of gas, electricity bills, and that affects everyone. But for instance, Black and brown households, low-income households may not have efficient buildings, which is another investment we need to make. That means they pay more in energy, or they drive more and they're going to pay more. And dividends can help, but again, there's a broad suite of investment and standards we need to institute across the economy. So next slide, please. And then again, in California, we've seen that, I showed the slide about the toxic waste facilities before. When corporations are forced to make a cost benefit analysis, if there are two facilities, say in one state, one in a wealthier, wider community, they will cut that down and pay the fine in a Black and Latino community without the political power, or say the where it's cheaper to continue that operate. And this has continued to happen throughout the country, where we're now at the point where in a respiratory pandemic, we have 1 in 1,000 African Americans dying from COVID-19. Very early in the pandemic, they established that link between the two. And there's a range of health effects. So carbon pricing can work with clean energy standards. It can work with a range of investments and like California dedicates 25% of their investments and even more than that towards disadvantaged communities. New York does the same thing, but it's not a silver bullet. Democrats have really aligned across the standards investment justice framework, and we have a great chance of getting that across the finish line. It's likely that this will all fit into a reconciliation package. This next infrastructure package, there's a great chance we can get those clean electricity standards in there, investments in buildings, and all kinds of other things in there. And that can work in complement with a suite of policies, but that is the heart of what we're advocating for. And so I will move it to questions. I know that I really kind of may have gotten in the weeds, or maybe not enough. So just happy to elaborate more on anything.
And Wes, that was great. And Christina, we probably have let's take about 3 minutes of questions so we can get that. Okay.
All right, Wes, I see some questions in the chat, and I will give you the first one that I see here, which says, who is leading the rural or red regions in climate legislation? It appears to me most of the public energy for legislation comes from urban and possibly suburban areas, and that's from Mark Lyon.
Yeah, I cannot speak specifically to all of the groups that are working on this, but I think that there's been really good leadership from electric co-ops in a lot of states. And I would say to look into some of the groups that I listed as aligned such as not only the Thrive Network, but USCAN or like Blue Green Alliance. I don't have a good answer for that at the moment. I think that that's an area that needs a lot more work. We have a plan for the USDA for agriculture to like revitalize rural America, and I believe we consulted with a wide range of groups on that. But there's a lot more work that needs to be done, and I think Biden also needs to be pushed on getting an agenda for rural areas.
All right, thank you. Next question is from Phyllis Terwilliger, which says, is there a targeted year to end subsidies to the oil and gas industry? That might help speak to like what timeline we're dealing with here.
Yeah, there is not, Biden, I would say he committed within the first term, but there's not a targeted year. I mean, these are things that we really can end either by legislation or executive action immediately. And that is a lot of money that we can reinvest back in our communities and back into climate solutions. And I would say that it should be done within the first year.
All right, and we have time for one more question, which is from Mark Lyon again, which says, how are we approaching this differently and more strategically than when President Obama came into office? Many promises made that were not feasible upon further study and experience. So what are we doing differently this time?
I think the framework approach is part of the difference, because Biden, I think Obama had a theory of we have limited political capital, going to do healthcare, and then we're going to do climate, and he separated climate from as an economic issue or as a racial justice issue. And this now has a broad base of support, but also it's being thrown into this Biden's economic recovery plan, his climate plan. Obama put about $90 billion of a $900 billion bill in renewables. And that actually did a lot to put the renewable market where it is now. But if if now this $2 trillion package, all of that is, investments in, solar and wind and in manufacturing, American manufacturing, and in building out energy efficient housing, fixing the grid, that is going to go so much farther than the minor fraction that Obama actually put in the time. So I think that there's and then again, Obama also had a different coalition in the House and the Senate, and here we're really only talking about a few more, maybe we just have to balance with Manchin and Sinema to get them on board with some parts of the package, but in some ways they're even asking for more investment. So I think the economics are different and the approach is different. Yeah.
Great. Hey, Wes, that was great. Thank you so much. And the thing that I'm taking away from that, there's a lot, but the main thing I'm taking away from that is standards, investments, environmental justice. That's what I heard you saying the framework was that Evergreen is looking at, and that the Biden administration seems to be as well. So that was excellent. And if you can stay on with us, please do, but understand if you have to leave as well, but that was really great. Andrew, you've got your full 10 minutes. I'm going to go ahead and introduce you now. Andrew shares that he has been a Christian since the 1980s. He worships at Elma United Methodist Church in the Upper New York Conference, where he is the church pianist and leads the congregation's creation care ministry. In addition to his work with Elma UMC, Andrew is a global ministries earthkeeper and volunteers for Citizen Climate Lobby. Professionally, Andrew is a statistician in pharmaceutical research. He is married and has 2 grown children. And Andrew's going to give a quick overview of the key executive actions that the Biden administration has taken so far, and then take a few questions. And we've got a little fat at the end, Andrew, so I don't think you need to, you can take your full, take about 8 or 9 minutes for your talk, and then maybe a couple minutes for a question or two.
Yep, excellent. Okay, thank you, Paul, for that nice introduction, and also for the previous speakers, which were very informative for me. So I want to summarize the executive orders and other actions that we've seen so far from the Biden administration, and having an overview of those can help us to appreciate the priorities of this administration, and it can also help us learn about the types of government climate action we can promote most successfully for the next 4 years. I'm happy to say that Wes actually stole some of my thunder talking about executive orders, so maybe I could be a little bit more brief and give a little bit more time for Q&A at the end. Plus, I'm not going to cover all of Biden's executive actions or EAs that have been signed so far. Instead, I'm just like a statistician usually does, I want to give a representative sample and mention just a few of those and why we should know about them. My main point, though, is to glean from them what we can learn about Biden's climate priorities, so that as United Methodists, we can productively lobby for government actions that promote the UMC principles. So next, please. Actually, if you can go back, I apologize, that was a little bit premature. I wanted to cover just a little bit more about executive actions and executive orders, given that we have just a little bit more time. So executive actions are really any actions taken by the president, including executive orders or EOs. And I'll talk mostly about EOs today. You might be surprised to learn that EOs are not mentioned in the US Constitution or defined by federal statute. However, EOs are implied by Article 2, and they can have the force of law. So in short, EOs are exactly what they sound like: orders produced by the president as the head of the executive branch that are generally directed to and govern actions by government officials and agencies. So next, please. So today I want to describe briefly some of the most important EOs related to climate the president has enacted and those from previous presidents that he has canceled. These EOs are the ones in bold in your handouts, and they tell us something about the priority that he puts on climate action and the ways that he wants the federal government to slow and stop climate change. That can help us to see the kinds of climate actions, just like I said before, that he is most likely to support going forward. Next. So here are some highlights of the executive order so far. I want to mention about the EO that pauses new leases on federal land for oil drilling because it signals a respect for Native Americans and nature. And to me, this signals a significant break from the America First philosophy of the recent past. And then there's also the Make America Resilient executive order, which directs NOAA and FEMA to study how the government can expand and improve climate forecast capabilities and information products for the public. So as you can see, this is not so much climate change mitigation, but rather climate change adaptation. One message with this EO is that responding to the climate crisis is not all about reducing climate change. It's also about preparing for the climate change impacts that are already happening and that we will not be able to prevent going forward. Next slide. The EAs that I already mentioned, being EOs, are most important because they have the force of law. You might want to know, though, about some other EAs already on the books. First is the action to, quote, spur jobs, innovation, science, and discovery. This is interesting because it's so far reaching. It will catalyze the all of government approach to respond to the climate crisis as a unified whole. This includes accounting for climate impacts in important government decisions, such as those regarding infrastructure or medicine. And to ensure the success of this action, Biden has moved fast to appoint a cabinet and other senior staff who believe the climate crisis is serious and must be responded to. In another important executive action, Biden revoked the permit for the Keystone XL pipeline and has shut down the pipeline's construction. As a third example, Biden has ordered federal agencies to consider climate change in their regulations, and this is expected to lead to clean energy standards. However, it's a process that will require at least 2 years and maybe even more, and will also entail many political battles along the way. So that's going to be a process rather than an event. So next slide. And what is all behind this? What are the motivating reasons for the administration to go forward with these particular EOs and EAs? Well, the White House says that EAs on public health and the environment so far aim to listen to the science, to improve public health and protect the environment, to ensure access to clean air and water, to limit exposure to dangerous chemicals and pesticides, to hold polluters accountable, including those who disproportionately harm communities of color and low-income communities, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, to bolster resilience to the impacts of climate change, to restore and expand our national treasures, and our national monuments, and to prioritize both environmental justice and the creation of well-paying union jobs necessary to deliver on these goals. So you're aware that the United Methodist Church promotes actions that preserve the climate while protecting vulnerable and disadvantaged communities. And therefore, I think you can see that the new administration too is promoting those goals, and there's a significant overlap between what the administration is doing and what we as United Methodists want to do. So in summary, with the next slide, I want you to take away from this discussion that the EAs signed by Biden so far and his stated reasons for doing so suggest his climate goals significantly overlap with the UMC social principles in caring for God's creation via climate action and in helping communities globally transition to resilience and prosperity, especially those who are dependent on the current economy or are harmed by that economy. Number two, we could expect that if we United Methodists support climate action that promotes these principles, we will be building on a foundation of support that already exists in the Biden administration. It's not something that we're creating out of thin air, ex nihilo. And number three, the executive actions so far suggest that Biden's, quote, all of government approach involves both direct actions and the adjustments of existing policies and practices. So we do in fact have all of government working towards this goal of keeping the planet habitable. So that's all I have, and I hope that you found this information helpful.
Great. And Christina, let's just take like 2 minutes for questions for Andrew.
All right, there were a few questions in the chat. Let me go back a little bit. Let me find it. Is there a way, so I think this was, the question was getting at, and I think it was even answered in the chat a little bit, but, you know, is there a way to make these executive orders more permanent? So another president coming in cannot rescind them. Later in the chat, we heard that the perfect way to do that is legislation. So do you want to speak to that at all, Andrew?
Well, it's definitely true. Of course, we could hope that we do have a president in the future who is supportive of climate action, and that's by no means a sure thing. But you know, in my mind at least, climate impacts are going to hit us more and more as time goes on, and maybe we will gain some support in the next few years for climate action. You know, already we see forest fires spreading. We see more Lyme disease in my neck of the woods, Western New York. We see more flooding and droughts. So my prayer is that these things would wake us up to the need for caring for God's creation.
And the last question I see here is, and this may be kind of a blanket question to several people, maybe not just particularly you, Andrew, but where are we in terms of nuclear power? You know, nuclear power would be considered carbon free. And so that would help us hit some targets. I'm from Illinois. We have a lot of nuclear power in Illinois. And so we need the nuclear power as kind of a, you know, a base load until we can get our renewable energy up to speed by 2050 to be 100% renewable by 2050. So by 2030, we want, you know, nuclear would still be in the mix. So do you think, Andrew, that really depends on where you live?
Well, first I can say that the UMC social principles do not support nuclear power. So that's definitely something to keep in mind. And I'm sure that the people who wrote that are much more knowledgeable than I am. Secondly, there are many concerns that people don't think about with nuclear power. On the other hand, you can argue, especially with the new nuclear power technologies, that they are safer and they can be deployed more cheaply. So that's something on the other side and in the other direction. I also want to add, though, that many nuclear waste facilities are in areas that will be flooded in the next 5 years, or maybe 10. So we have to think about that waste even in the immediate term and with the waste that already exists.
Sure. And they're also located in, you know, communities, native communities and things that, you know, don't want it there either. So we can't just continue to keep harming, you know, vulnerable communities.
Yeah. I think a lot of that is going to rest and depend on our ability to store renewable energy in terms of moving water uphill, or maybe better batteries, and how fast those technologies can be deployed.
Very good.
All right. Well, listen, I'm gonna move us ahead, but Andrew, that was really great. Thank you so much. And it's because it's really helpful to know what has been done with executive actions and orders. And it also then, as was pointed out, we also recognize that those can be undone, and that's why congressional action is critical as well. So John Hill, and if we could, yeah, John's slide is already up, will now share his thoughts about where things might be headed with this current Congress. And John is the Deputy General Secretary for Advocacy and Grassroots Organizing, and Director of Economic and Environmental Justice for the United Methodist Church's Board of Church and Society, where he's been on staff since 2002. Prior to that, John served as a legislative aide in Congress and as a lobbyist in the private sector. And John shares, and this is probably the best thing of all, that he is inspired and energized by the children he teaches each Sunday at Boundary United Methodist Church in Washington, D.C. And John, you know, maybe maybe try to do 8 minutes in presentation and 2 minutes for questions, because time is pressing. So, but you know, don't feel too rushed. I've got a little fat built in at the very end. I'll try to make my final comments real short.
All right. All right. Thanks, Paul. I get it. Don't rush, but hurry up. So thanks, Andrew, for that really great outline of all the executive actions, which are so critical. Some things can only be done by executive action, order, and regulation, so that's really necessary. But as the question sort of highlighted, we also need longer term durable solutions. Sometimes we get this whiplash between every new administration undoing the last administration's work through executive action. So we want to talk a little bit about what climate legislation might look like in the 117th Congress. Congress is still kind of getting its bearings. The Senate was a little delayed in its committee assignments as they were trying to order themselves. So some legislation still in the process of being introduced, and agendas are really just now getting set. So I think it's really important for us, and I don't want to steal Paul's thunder later, but for us to just more than anything impress upon Congress how action on climate is a moral imperative for this Congress. So what I wanted to do, and Jan has shepherded this handout along with the rest of us in this team that really goes through in really great a great overview of all the legislation that is currently kind of pending and possible within Congress. I wanted to think about it in kind of buckets for us. So to think about what solutions are kind of economy-wide that we might talk about, what are more sectoral approaches, things that might really target high emission sectors, and then through both of those things, we want to look at it through the lens of racial equity and racial justice, but also are there additional pieces that really need to that we need to support. Paul alluded to this, Wes alluded to this, right, around a just transition for either fossil dependent communities as well as climate vulnerable communities. So I just wanted to go through those three buckets. I think that might help us in the conversation. And then all of this, pretty much everything I'm saying is detailed in that handout. So when we think about economy-wide, and this is a solution that the federal advocacy team recommended last year and is still something that has a great deal of support, which is a carbon pricing system. And there are a variety of ways. Wes referenced the 2009 kind of cap and trade version. Now it's more of a cap and like a fee and dividend system, but basically to impose a tax on metric tons of carbon. A question of where you impose that fee, most efficient to do it really upstream at the mine, at the well, but knowing that those costs are going to flow throughout the supply chain and down to the consumer. So there's first a question about like what that cost will be, the idea to disincentivize the use and certainly shift demand towards low carbon products. But then once those fees are collected, what do we do with them? Can we make folks completely whole so that no one is harmed by the fee? So there's some questions of justice there. Can we offset more than just the cost for low-income households? Can it be a net positive for some folks? We know, just that federal benefits tend to exclude some categories of folks. So that's just something to be really careful of and attentive to. I'll say this is something that over the past 5-10 years has gained bipartisan support. So there is a lot of energy around it. And within the faith community back in 2019, I'll say we put together some interfaith principles for carbon pricing, trying to ensure that the issues that Wes talked about, the justice issues, are there ways that we can address those through a carbon pricing system? So that's kind of the economy-wide opportunity to tackle the climate crisis. When we get into sectoral approaches, first up is always the energy sector. That's something that we know is principal driver of emissions. So Wes already talked about clean energy standards. I don't need to go into that except to say that conversation we just had about nuclear is relevant to this, so that when we talk about clean, different from renewable, there are some questions for us as the faith community, as the United Methodist tradition, to talk about what we think is clean energy, safe, clean, healthy energy. So that's one of those questions. And as Wes said, 30 states already have some form of clean or renewable energy standards. Others have voluntary renewable energy goals, but there is sort of this bulk of practice within the states that we can learn from. The other thing we can talk about are sort of how do we improve energy efficiency and how do we incentivize this transition to clean energy? So expanded tax incentives for individuals, for businesses, for other institutions, increasing tax credits for installation of green energy. I'll say that the entirety of the Democratic caucus, the Ways and Means Committee, has introduced this like bucket of tax-related bills called the Green Act. So that's clearly where that particular committee, the Ways and Means Committee, is headed. And then also within energy, some of this is executive action, some of this plays out in Congress. How do we restrict or limit oil and gas leasing and exploration? And on the flip side, how might there be incentives for the use of public lands for renewables? In the transportation sector, we're really looking at things like incentivizing electric vehicles, zero emission vehicles, purchase incentives. How do you build out an electric vehicle charging network? Some of this was passed in infrastructure bill in 2020 on the House side. So there is some pre-existing language around this, but really how do you build out the capacity to expand use of electric vehicles and reduce emissions from fossil fuel burning cars? And then also this question around things like public transit, right? In the midst of this COVID pandemic, I live in Washington, DC, very few people are riding metro. And that's an important part of our transit system, a green transit system. And so how can we provide support for public transit that is really suffering right now because of reduced usage with the pandemic? And then another, Wes mentioned this, but didn't talk too much about it. There is a large, fairly hefty component of emissions from the agriculture sector. So how can we reduce that impact? Are there incentives for climate stewardship? How might we facilitate farmers and ranchers participating in carbon markets? That's been a bipartisan proposal. So for us, we're going to keep looking at all of those proposals through our United Methodist values, or values for both stewardship and for justice. But then there's another bucket of work to be done around this just transition, right? How are we going to help support communities that are fossil dependent now? How are we going to support communities that are heavily impacted? How are we going to invest in communities of color? And then how are we going to support climate vulnerable communities and countries internationally? So we have, lots of information, and I think that's been made clear already about how we might, the demonstrated need to support communities because of the brunt of climate pollution that they're facing. Wes referenced the Thrive agenda. That's really kind of a multifaceted collection of legislative proposals. Thrive is an acronym for Transform, Heal, and Renew by Investing in a Vibrant Economy. It's kind of the bones of what was called the Green New Deal before. This resolution last Congress was actually introduced by the now nominee Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland. So there is some energy around that Thrive agenda. Paul talked initially about the Reclaim Act, something that this legislative team approved as supported in the past. That's another important initiative, particularly for states and Indian tribes to use funds to support economically distressed mining communities. Thinking about this sort of holistically about affordable housing and what sort of weatherization or low-income housing assistance might be needed. And I noticed the question about me talking too quickly. Sorry, I took the cue to speed through this pretty quickly. Most of the information is on the sheet, and of course I'll be happy to answer questions. The last piece that I did want to lift up was this Green Climate Fund. What we've talked about mostly to date has been impacting the US community. The Green Climate Fund and other climate finance, international finance instruments are really important for supporting climate vulnerable communities outside of the US. I'll note that the GCF and the pledging period of countries to support climate vulnerable communities was really instrumental in getting the Paris Agreement adopted. It was a trust building exercise because for too long, climate vulnerable countries had felt sort of left out of the equation by the more heavily well-resourced countries who happen to be the heavy emitters. So this was part of our kind of trust building work to ensure a global agreement with the Paris Agreement. So excited that the Biden administration is rejoining the Paris Agreement. Very important for us to maintain and fulfill our pledges to instruments like the Green Climate Fund to demonstrate our commitment to solidarity with those impacted around the world. So the last thing I'll just say, and then we'll move on to questions. is, the question is always like, well, how are they going to get this done? What are the possible vehicles for action for this? Yes, maybe some of this will move as standalone legislation. Perhaps there's enough political will around a carbon pricing system or some other individual pieces to move that independently. We know in part forward-looking, there is some agenda already set by Congress right now, working on the COVID relief package. The House vote slipped until Saturday, but then that'll really occupy a lot of time in the Senate. The last COVID relief package, just a note, actually included climate relevant legislation around things such as, reducing hydrofluorocarbons, funding weatherization and public transit. So there is some climate relevant work perhaps, but really we think the next thing up is the infrastructure bill, and Wes referenced this. So what could be part of that infrastructure bill? The chair of the Select Committee on Climate, Congresswoman Castor, has said that they're going to use last year's bill as a template and a springboard. So we have some idea. Included in that was the EV charging network, incentives for purchasing EVs, a grid modernization. We know very clearly how important the grid is given the disaster that happened in Texas, wind and solar on public lands. So the Reclaim Act, so pieces of that could move on the infrastructure bill. And then also tracking, we know that Congress will always do its appropriations work. If it doesn't pass appropriations bills, the government shuts down. Those are kind of among the only must-pass bills each Congress. And that's where things like the Green Climate Fund and other climate finance instruments will be tracked. So that's another piece of our work, probably a little bit further down in the year, but another critical vehicle to think about for the climate legislation that we're tracking. So I'm going to stop there. That is a very quick overview, and I'm happy to either pull questions if you want to put them in the chat. Christina, I think, is going to queue those up.
Or Jan may.
Sorry.
Yeah. And probably just take 2 minutes on this. And again, it's just so much to cover. And thank you, John. You did a great job really fast. And it's all going to come into focus more as time goes along. So it's just kind of giving a sense of where things are going. But Jan, do you have a couple questions?
No, actually, I've been trying to solicit some questions, but haven't gotten any except for, could you just speak another few minutes or seconds about Thrive? We got some questions about the Thrive agenda, and Andrew has provided a link to Thrive in the chat. But if you could just say a few more words about that, John.
Yeah, I mean, the idea behind the Thrive agenda, if you look at it, much of it, and that's thriveagenda.com is the link. Much of it is still sort of conceptual. So the idea is that, as folks kind of heard with the Green New Deal, the idea that we can fund both good paying jobs, union jobs, and a green energy economy at the same time, so that we're sort of pouring the resources into BIPOC communities, Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, creating good, safe jobs, addressing the climate crisis, and addressing environmental racism. So it's kind of that multi-pronged approach.
Good.
Well, we might, if there's no other pressing questions, we might just go ahead and move on to make up a little bit of time. Is that okay, Jan, or did you see something?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. Well, again, John,
Well, I just did get, okay. I can answer this question. We have the question, do the bills in the House in the 116th Congress have to be reintroduced in the 117th Congress? And the answer is yes. They have to be reformulated and reintroduced. So.
Okay.
Clean slate every Congress.
Yeah. Well, again, like I was saying, John, that's really great. And there's just so much that we just don't know for sure about yet. And so a lot of this is going to be coming into focus over the next weeks and months. And we're going to try to stay right on top of it and let everybody who's on this call know how that unfolds. So we can now take 10 minutes for our breakout session, and then we'll just have a few closing remarks that I will have about kind of a little bit of a call to action or an invitation to action, and just a couple of announcements. So Jan, can you just introduce us to this last breakout session? And
sure.
Right
as Christina puts everybody in their breakouts, just make sure that you post your responses in the chat once you return, and Christina and I will again go through those and read some of them aloud, but everybody will be able to see them. So make sure you put your information in the chat. Good discussion. Thanks.
Okay, there's a few of you who are not in a room yet. Give me 1 second and I will get you put in a room, okay? Thank you for your patience. Okay, you should all have an assignment now. Kelly can go through. Ah, 17. Hi, Mom. All right, is everybody who wants to be in a room in a room? I see Claire, John, and Kelly. Wait, Kelly, John, Tom.
Hi, Christina. This is Jan Ginsler. I had to join by computer and phone because the new computer I got, which I will return on Saturday, doesn't have audio or microphone.
Oh, no. Do you want to get in a room then, or is it too hard to
I thought I
participate?
was in Breakout too. What happened?
Okay. All right, let me see if I can get you into. Hold on. Oh, wait. Hold on. You're into. You're into. Then why are you here? Hold on. I don't know what's happening.
Well, I see on my computer that I'm with Susan Johnston, but I can't talk or see anything on my
Okay.
computer. I can only see it on my computer.
Oh,
I mean, on my
see what
phone.
happened. All right, hang on. Let me put you in a different room and see if I can then move you back. Hold on. There. I think I got it. You there? I think it worked. Okay, if you're having any trouble, go ahead and just unmute and I can try to help you as best I can. Got about 6 more minutes in the group. Oh, I see, Kathleen, you said that you're just going to listen. That's fine. That's fine. Breakouts aren't for everyone. It's okay.
Okay, everybody's coming back. And now we're going to look at the chat and see what people had to say. What was exciting or inspiring to you? Go ahead and type it in the chat, and Christina and I will read those out. Hope for the future and saving our planet. Awesome. That's great. I'm glad this left people hopeful. That's so important. Anybody else have something they want to say about the conference? Aha, listen to science, hold polluters accountable. More people are hopeful. Hope for the future and saving our planet. Awesome. Yeah. Encouraged by Biden's attitude and competence. What is the plan for future webinars? Are we going to meet regularly? Yes, okay. That's a good question for Paul at the end. The church can feel confident that the bills are aligned with the social principles. Yes, that's was part of the analysis that we did. More convinced than ever that this is a moral issue. In our group, they said, align Christian values to make policy. Equity mapping. Our group was dominated by lobbying for vegetarianism. That's interesting. There's also regenerative agriculture you might want to look into. Encouraged by competent appointees in the new government. Christina, you want to say anything?
I don't know. There's a lot coming in the chat, which is great. And I'll mention that I will save this chat. Mostly if there's any questions that need to be answered that we didn't get to, we'll try to address those later. And we may take some of these, quotes to, go forward and help us, to form future webinars, because there will be more going forward. So thank you for your participation in the chat. And if we're going to stay on target, I think we probably need Paul to wrap us up. So thank you so much for participating.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, this is great. I think this worked out so well with the breakout sessions. I loved the pair of people that I was with. And thanks Jan for leading those, and Christina for helping out as well with all of that. So and just quickly, yes, there will be more webinars, and I'll get to that in just a second. But as we move towards wrapping this up, I want to just suggest some next steps. And Christina, do you have that slide up? I think you do. I'm having a hard time seeing my script and the slides at the same time. But our overall goal is indeed to build a strong and growing movement of United Methodists who engage in advocating for public policies to protect all of God's good creation. And it's our hope that you are ready to explore ways that you can do that. So we invite you to take the following specific actions. First, sometime in the next few days, tomorrow would be great, or sometime early next week, please contact your congressperson in the House of Representatives and your 2 senators, either by email or phone, and urge them to make addressing climate change a top priority in 2021. May not be ready quite yet to say what specific legislation, because that's so much in flux, but just to say that message, please make climate change a top priority for you in 2021. And I will just say that one really easy way to do that is to go to the Action Alert link, urging exactly that, which was just sent out by Church and Society. I believe it was sent out today. I don't know if we're able to get that into the chat box or not, but we'll certainly send that in the follow-up email, because it is basically just asking that very thing. It's a message that says to make climate a priority. And it's one of those automatic things where it will go to your reps and senators directly, but you're also able to personalize it. And that's really important for you to share your personal story about why this is important to you as a person, but as a person of faith, and as United Methodists. And also we will be, and there may be a link, and I think there's a slide, and we will definitely send this in a follow-up email. There's a great resource from Church and Society called Creating Change Together, which gives tips on effectively communicating with your representatives and senators. Also, we invite you to stay engaged. That's what I heard a lot of people saying, is that they want to make sure that they stay engaged with the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement. And there's 3 ways to do this. First, and this will all be in the follow-up email. First, if you are not already on the United Methodist Creation Justice Movement email list, you can sign up by emailing umcreationjustice@gmail.com. And you will receive at least monthly updates on educational and advocacy opportunities. Second, please share your advocacy experiences through a Google document that we'll send you. What did you learn from your efforts to engage with your members of Congress? What questions came up for you? What hurdles did you run into? And then the third thing is to join in the next in this series of Faithful Advocacy webinars, which will be March 23rd at 6:30 p.m. Central Time, where participants will have an opportunity to share about their advocacy experiences and to learn about an effective letter writing campaigns as an advocacy tool. Also, the last slide on here will be of us who were on the presenters tonight, and be in touch with us if you have questions. And again, we've thrown a lot at you. So we're going to be sending a follow-up email that has a lot of these links and resources. So really just so glad that you tuned in, and we look forward to continuing to be engaged with you as we build a strong movement of United Methodists engaged in advocacy for creation justice. I want to thank all of our presenters this evening. I know that they put a lot of time and effort into what they shared this evening. So thanks to each one of them, and thank all of you for being on here. So I think we've done what we hoped to this evening, and we're right at ending time. So just go with this blessing. May God watch over and keep you and your loved ones. And may God give us all the deep passion, the wisdom, the courage, and most importantly, the love to be better protectors of creation. Amen, and go in peace. Amen.
Wonderful presentation. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Paul, you could mention the previous webinars. You didn't do that.
Yeah, if you go to the Creation Justice Movement website, there are links to a webinar that was done in January that really talked about just the how-tos, the whys and the how-tos of faithful advocacy around this issue. And then there was one also last May that kind of did a similar thing, but the most recent one was in January. But really glad to have everybody who was on here. I'm so bad about Zoom that I was only really able to see my script and the slides. So it's nice to actually see some faces now. I recognize some of you for sure.
Will we be able to get a recording of this to show to our home congregation or our committees?
Christina, you want to say a word about that?
Yes, ma'am. I recorded, and I will stop recording in a minute, and that will get sent to you in your follow-up email tomorrow.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thank you.
And Christina, you and I will just need to put our heads together about that follow-up email. Yeah, I think you're going to kind of get it rolling, and I'm going to see if there's anything I would add or not. Is that okay?
Yes, sir. Okay.
And interested people are going to have a